I've really enjoyed, I don't know about you, our Mental Health Awareness Month. I didn't think that I would because it's such a difficult topic and one that's very close to my own heart, but actually I've been enjoying it every single week. And I've been looking forward to today when, of course, Alistair and Daniel are with us, and Alistair is going to be bringing us our message segment today. And without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Alistair. Please welcome.
Hello. How lovely to be here, and thank you so much, Michael.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Michael, for inviting me. It's really wonderful. I've never been to the village here, and it's such a great event. And I'm really delighted to have been invited to talk during this week on mental health. I just wanted to say a little bit about why I might be invited. Just not here because I present Escape to the Country, although there are mental health issues involved. That's another talk. No, I'm actually here because I also work as a psychotherapist here in Brighton, and I also teach mindfulness and meditation. And a couple of people here have been to the course that I teach actually at St Mary's, just across the way. And I was really intrigued by the framework of mental health awareness, because obviously with my clients I come in contact with lots of people struggling with their minds, and also when I'm teaching mindfulness and meditation, that's also the same sort of ballpark. So I thought it would be interesting. Well, to be honest, I thought I'm going to talk about something that I'm interested in, and hopefully that interest will kind of spill out to you guys as well. I am notorious for over-talking, so I'm going to, about 15 minutes, is that right? You're going to hook me off if I go too long. I wanted to speak about this phrase, the survival of the gentlest. So obviously that's not the phrase. The phrase is the survival of the fittest. Because this is an area that comes up again and again and has come up in my life, and I see it comes up again and again in so many of my clients, and particularly my LGBT clients. Because there is a guiding narrative that we, born into this century and born into this sort of time, have sort of imbued, or sort of drunk in from the culture, which is a sort of a distortion, in fact, of the idea of Charles Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest. So I'm sure you're aware where this phrase comes from. It comes from The Origin of the Species, and Darwin's idea, which I'm sure you also know about, genetic fitness, sort of passing down through the ages. So growing up as a gay man in a little village down on the south coast and singing in the choir, which was a little flashback of singing as we were singing there, I drank in a lot of the sort of spiritual, sort of numinous qualities of being in church and having that connection with that special place, but didn't connect with Christianity, and actually now I'm practicing Buddhist. So I sort of took a different path. But what was interesting is when I was thinking about giving this talk, and Michael said, what reading would you like? And I was thinking, Survival of the Gentlest. And there's a great deal of very interesting scientific writing around this subject, which I'll probably weave in if I can. But my mind immediately went to the Beatitudes, to the preaching of, right at the beginning of the Sermon of the Mount. Of course, the sermon goes on for another 2 chapters, but this bit is perhaps the most famous bit. And it was very interesting to me because I think probably last time I read it, I was 18 doing my divinity A-level. But it was very interesting to come back to it and read those words again, partly because Daniel and I went up to London last weekend to see the Karmapa. So the Karmapa is in Tibetan Buddhism. He's the big new thing. He's the new Dalai Lama. It's the first time he'd ever come to the UK, and he gave a couple of days of teaching in Battersea. And we went up, and it tied in very much into the studies that I'm doing in Buddhism at the moment, which are about compassion. So, as I'm sure you may not know, but compassion is as important to Buddhism as it is to Christianity. But it's sort of framed slightly differently, and I thought it might be quite useful for me to talk about that framing, because it might cast some light onto your thoughts about it. But also because when I was hearing those words from the Beatitudes, I immediately thought of some texts in what they call Mahayana Buddhism. So Mahayana Buddhism is the second turning of Buddhist history. The first one was the historical Buddha, about 500 years before Christ. And the Mahayana was sort of around the same time of Christ, actually, but then sort of stretched on for another 400-500 years. And it's the Mahayana that really concentrates on compassion. The early iterations of Buddhism was about personal liberation from suffering, and then in the sort of 1,000 years afterwards, there was this sense, well, it's not really good being personally liberated if everybody else is still suffering. So then the goalpost moved, and it didn't become personal liberation, it became universal liberation. So that I can't rest happy in myself, knowing that any one sentient being, and that includes all animals as well, is still suffering. So it's obviously quite a big challenge. And very inspiring. And one of the techniques that Tibetan Buddhism uses is this idea of swapping self for other. And it's very counterintuitive to people coming to it in our westernized, very competitive, quite egocentric culture. The basic idea is, and it's summed up in a phrase that the Karmapa taught us at the weekend, is defeat to myself and victory to others. So it's very it really cuts against the sort of capitalistic, me, greed is good sort of culture that, certainly when I was growing up in Thatcher's era, was very much in the air. And it cuts it in such a kind of counterintuitive way, because it's like, ooh, I've got to take on all the suffering and give away all the goodness. So it's not like I'm going to share all the goodness and take a little bit of your suffering. It's like, no, if you're really suffering, I'm going to take it from you and I'm going to give you all the happiness that I have. So it's a very it's a big chop to the root of the tree of ego, talking in Buddhist terms. This idea that secretly, even in and actually later on in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus alludes to this. We give our good deeds and we make sure that everyone sees it. He talks about the Pharisees sort of showing off their virtue, and he also cut into the root of ego by saying, no, hide your good deeds. It's the heart that matters. It's the pure heart that matters. And then we start to get into very similar language to the Buddhist teachers, because one of the ways of talking about this Mahayana Buddhism is called the awakening heart, bodhicitta. Bodhi is the Sanskrit word you get the word Buddha from, so the awoken one. And the citta is the heart-mind, so this part of our knowing consciousness. And so there's this great sense of waking up. The heart actually involves stopping thinking about yourself all the time and actually thinking about others. And the Dalai Lama very famously said, all our suffering comes from worrying about ourselves, and all our joy and happiness comes from caring for others. So it's a sort of topsy-turvy antidote to the very self-fixated culture that we live in. And sadly, a lot of spiritual practice gets caught up in that, unintentionally probably. But it's all about self-actualization. I've got to find my inner self. I've got to free the core of myself. And subtly, that's just constantly reinforcing this idea that it's all about me. Me. And I could go into countless examples where over the years, I've been practicing for about 16 years, and I've been on retreats, so like Buddhist retreats where you can go a couple of weeks somewhere where it's really quiet and practice. And I've crashed up against some awful, that I'm sitting there cross-legged and looking really pious. And basically I'm just hating the person next to me because they cough, or I can't bear the shoes on that person. That person in the queue took all the kind of like the good tofu, and it was really kind of like me, it's my tofu and it's my kind of peace and quiet. And so this is it's a very pervasive meme in Buddhist practice, to sort of really be very naked about your egotism, about, it's okay, we all do that. But the damage comes where we don't acknowledge it, where we like, I'm all loving and kind. But actually, the undercurrent is always like, yeah, but you better damn well appreciate my charity, and you better tell everyone about it. And you better, if I'm nice to you, you better be nice to me when I need you. So the Sermon on the Mount, and certainly all these teachings in Tibetan Buddhism, are really about kind of trying to chop that down right at the root. And what I wanted to talk a bit about today is some of the research. I'm very interested in neuroscience and what they call evolutionary psychology. So this is the wonderful blossoming field of study around looking at the kind of evolutionary underpinnings of human behavior. Why do we have emotions, for example? Why did animals, like humans, get consciousness? Why can we think about ourselves? Where do all these things that actually causes a lot of heartache, strong emotions like sadness and depression and grief, constantly thinking about ourselves, and painful self-consciousness, these are pretty much the root of all mental health issues. So what I found really useful over the years studying is trying to understand, well, okay, these things happen. They seem to happen to all of us. What is the evolutionary, what is the reason for them? And can I make peace with the kind of biological, the physiological underpinnings of this? And understanding where they come from, does that actually shed some light on what's happening? And so coming back to this phrase, the survival of the fittest, and the survival of the gentlest as its antidote. Growing up as a gay man in that sort of framework of what they call neo-Darwinian sort of red in tooth and claw, you've got to be the strongest and fastest, and you've got to beat everyone, you've got to be richer than everyone. And also you've got to have more offspring than everybody else in order to validate your existence on the planet. This is a shit narrative if you're a gay woman. Because, it's really invalidated. Obviously, we can have children now through the wonders of science, and we can always adopt. But if that is the narrative that we live under, that actually our value as beings on the planet comes from having lots of kids and simply reproducing our genes, this is a terrible narrative to buy into. And so many of my clients, I used to work for Terence Higgins, and almost all my clients were gay men. So many of my clients, when we really got down to it, they did believe in their bones that their sexuality was an aberration, that their being gay just was, just didn't fit in. It wasn't natural. It wasn't divine. It wasn't part of the natural process. And I could see as I started to study that I had drunk that in too myself, and that there was a certain sort of emptiness or hollowness to my kind of waving the flag and being proud. Because right in the centre of it there was this nagging doubt, well, what is the point of my life on earth? And I wanted to allude to this wonderful book that I really encourage you to kind of track down in the library, or get your library to order and place on the shelves, which is called Biological Exuberance. It's a wonderful book by a biologist called Bruce Badgermill. I think he's American. It's a great big fat book, and most of it is filled up with absolutely delightful field studies of non-heteronormative behaviour in the animal kingdom. So it's, you know, gay swans and lesbian geese and like giraffes and safe sex and polyamory and sort of all sorts of like extraordinary variety, exuberance of sexual behaviours. And he makes this really interesting point that, for example, this is the one I remember, that in the whole course of like field studies of giraffes, there have been innumerable more sightings of male-on-male mounts than there have been of male-female mounting. And that in some species of voles, for example, only 2% breed. The other 98% actively avoid sex and reproduction. There are some manatees, I think I'd have to check this, manatees, females, who plug their vaginas so that they don't have to go through the horror of having children. So that there's this counter-narrative. When you start to mine down into the biological facts, there's this counter-narrative to this, like, oh, you know, life on Earth is just about reproducing your genes and spitting out children down the kind of through history. And he has this wonderful kind of counter-narrative that actually life on Earth is about exuberance, it's about variety, it's about fantastic kind of variation and mutation, and that if it was just about reproducing genes, we'd be amoebas that simply just split and make photocopies of ourselves. And the whole purpose of life, and Antonio Damasio is another famous sort of neuroscientist, he also says the whole purpose of life is not just to kind of replicate yourself, it's to exude an excess of energy. So you create an excess. You fill the world with kind of excess of yourself, your unique self. And so this was, this was probably when I was in my 30s, when I was studying to be a psychotherapist. I read this book and I was like, oh God, this has completely kind of changed it's freed me up from this really oppressive sort of Victorian, Darwinian cosh. And then recently I've been doing a lot of study about another field of neuroscience which is called interpersonal, intersubjective psychotherapy, which is looking very much at the development of the brain, so how our brains develop over time, and particularly the unique way that human brains develop. And you probably know this, but humans are essentially born about 20 years premature. There was a very funny neuroscientist there who said the sanctity of the fetus in his Brooklyn neighborhood lasts until the second year of graduate med school. so that the child-parent bond is enormously long in humans. I'm sure you may have seen like lambs being born or little animals being born, and the mother is like, and the lamb comes up, and like within seconds he's like, and he kind of goes he stands up, walks to the udder, and starts to suckle. Human babies are hopeless. We're born so early, we can't do anything, we can't walk, we can't feed ourselves. It's years, before we can, be mobile. It's like decade before we have anything near like a chance to defend ourselves against anybody. Really, our brains don't stop growing until the mid-20s. So, and of course the reason why we're born so premature is because our brains are so enormous. If we came out with a full-size brain, we would kill our mothers. So there's an evolutionary reason why we come out with these kind of sort of blank, small brains, and then it grows and grows and grows and grows. The first 18 months is a fantastic explosion of growth, and then again in teenage, another explosion of growth. But what's really fascinating about that, and again, if you think about the evolutionary kind of magic of it, is that in a way, that dependency, that absolute helpless dependency that we have as infants, forces us to bond into social groups. And we are absolutely reliant on the gentleness and kindness of the people around us. And that's not just for our physical survival, of course. If we didn't have parents who fed us, we didn't have a care group or a social group around us, we'd starve to death and we'd die. But actually what's really fascinating is that it's entirely the premise for our big brilliant brains. Our brains do not grow if there are not people around us, looking after us, protecting us, caring for us. And it doesn't have to be like a perfect, like Uber Earth Mother kind of watching our every needs. It can be quite a crappy parent. It doesn't really matter. But the brain is predetermined to grow synaptically, all the little, branches of the neurons. They grow and they're ready and primed to grow as soon as there's someone that they can react to. And they don't grow if there's nobody. There's awful studies done on those poor Romanian orphans. And remember the fall of Ceausescu, there were all these orphanages where the children were orphaned and they were just strapped to their beds as babies. So they couldn't get out of bed and they were not sort of played with or they weren't allowed to move. And they have massive holes in their brains. Their brains are functionally kind of destroyed because there was no human-to-human interaction. There was no loving or sort of semi-loving care. It doesn't even have to be perfect care, it just needs to be some kind of care. And that's because evolutionarily we are a result of caring units. You can have the biggest, strongest silverback alpha male in your clan, but if there's no care, everybody's going to die. So it's a shit clan. So you need to really have as much care and gentleness and attunement, and this is the key thing, attunement as possible for strength and fitness to flourish. And of course what's interesting is that Darwin used this, well actually he didn't use it, Spencer used it and then Darwin co-opted it, survival of the fittest. The original phrase was natural selection. But when he says fittest, he doesn't mean like strongest. He's not talking about fit in, as in physically fit. He's talking about something that fits into the environment, fits into the niche ecology. So if we fit, then we flourish. And the reason we fit is because we attune to one another. And more importantly, perhaps, we attune to the world. So in fitting into the environment, into our surroundings, into the people around us, this is what's made human beings so successful. And this is what makes, I think, a human life so successful. And just to sort of come all the way round, this question of the heart, about cultivating the heart, the awakening heart, is, I believe, not about something that's a private experience. It's not something that you can generate inside yourself by meditation or by prayer or by perhaps even divine inspiration. I believe that this flourishing, however we want to see that flourishing of being human occurs because we attune to one another. We see one another. We listen to one another. We are aware of one another's behaviour. And we tolerate it. Well, more than tolerate it, we love it. We are able to remain in ourselves and be with that behaviour, whatever it is. And so this is where I think, coming full circle, this is where the Sermon on the Mount and these teaching of Tibetan Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, really come together. They see that we are pro-social beings. Our fulfillment is not an individual or isolated event. Our fulfillment comes by attuning to others. And this is not some abstract, it means the person sitting next to you. It's about making eye contact, about listening. The brain grows, the brain flourishes when we make eye contact and we smile, and someone smiles back and we feel safe, and then all the connections in the brain start to join up. And in some ways you could define mental health as this sort of mental flourishing, the sense of not being afraid to be interconnected. And the great tragedy of so much mental illness is this reclusive, it's coming back into a shell, detaching and trying to solve it all ourselves. And this is the great tragic, and this really goes against the whole flow of evolutionary history. We are not islands. We're not individuals. we are so interwoven with each other, and it makes no sense to talk about the strongest or the fittest. It only makes sense to think about those around us, and also the earth around us that supports us and nourishes us. And so, in conclusion, I think and it doesn't really matter how you get there, through prayer or through meditation. All those things, I think, are important, but the most important thing is community. The most important thing is being able to look at another human being in the eyes and feel loved, or able to love them, or just to be with them, even if they're mad and crazy and like annoying you, just to give them the victory, to give them the spotlight, because they will teach your brain to grow, they will teach your heart to open, and nothing else can. Nothing else, in my opinion, nothing else can open the heart like being in the presence of another. And it can be an intimate, a lover, it can also be a stranger, and it can also be an animal, it can also just be, the otherness of the sea, the otherness of nature. As soon as we retreat into ourselves, then we stop flourishing. And as soon as we're brave enough and encouraged enough to open up and connect, then it's more than survival, it's true existence.